Have you ever wondered how much a seemingly ordinary, peaceful family can hide deep secrets? My older brother, Chris, was one of those people. When I was a child, I always looked up to him. He was quiet, careful, but carried a certain charisma that commanded respect from everyone around him. Chris was the type of person who never did anything half-hearted. Every word, every action carried its own weight. Chris married Taylor when he was 27. Taylor was gentle, intelligent, and kind-hearted. Shortly after their wedding, they had a son. At first, everything seemed perfect. Weekend mornings spent together as a family. The sound of laughter filling the house. Trips to the beach where Chris and Taylor held hands like newlyweds. I watched them and thought that perhaps marriage could truly bring complete happiness. I remember those peaceful moments clearly. Every evening, as the sunlight spilled into the living room, Chris would often sit by the window, staring outside silently. At first, I thought it was just his contemplative habit, but over time, I realized there was something deeper in his eyes, a feeling only he could understand. Taylor had no idea. She still smiled, cared for their son, and trusted in the happiness of their little family. There were days when the whole family gathered in the kitchen to bake, or simply drank tea together, sharing stories about their day. I watched Taylor carefully prepare the tea, attentive in every gesture, and heard my nephew giggle when Chris playfully teased him. My heart felt warm. Even small moments, like Chris teaching his son how to tie his shoes, became precious memories in my eyes. I thought perhaps true happiness was just these little moments, but it was within these peaceful moments that I began to notice subtle changes. Chris smiled less, sometimes sat quietly alone, his eyes distant as if carrying an invisible burden. During dinners, when Taylor talked about work or small daily matters, Chris would only smile lightly or nod, but never truly participate. I saw it, and part of me began to sense that something was changing that I couldn't yet understand. During my visits in the afternoons, I would see Chris standing by the window, holding a cup of coffee, silent. There were times my nephew would run up, reaching to be held by his father. But Chris would bend down, smile gently, then return to his quiet spot. No words were spoken, only a sense of distance, and I knew this wasn't like before. I told myself he was probably tired from work, or maybe it was just the early days of being a father. But inside me, worry grew, a vague feeling of unspoken things. I began noticing every little detail. Chris answering phone calls more softly than usual, occasionally sighing or sitting silently after dinner. I knew there was something he was hiding, something significant enough to change the lives of this family. I also noticed that Taylor still trusted and found her own happiness. She smiled at her son, told him fun stories, prepared breakfast with love. I watched them, my heart both warm and anxious. I realized that happiness was fragile, easily hurt, and sometimes a single secret could change everything. And so, I began remembering every detail, every moment, the sunny afternoons, the children's laughter, Chris's silent gaze, so that when everything changed, I would remember that there was once a time when all seemed peaceful, seemingly endless. But, as I was about to realize, the peace was only on the surface. Beneath it, subtle changes were slowly spreading, quietly, preparing the storm that would hit this little family. By the time their son was about 3, the changes in Chris had become impossible to ignore. The mornings weren't cheerful anymore. The warm smiles had faded. He started coming home later, and when he did, he would stand quietly in a corner, watching his son play without engaging. Taylor began to sigh more, her eyes often filled with sadness. And sometimes she would turn to me and say, "I feel like he's pulling away. I don't know what to do." I watched Chris every day. The little habits, the details that once seemed normal, now felt different. At dinner, he barely spoke, responding with soft oohs or yas, but never really sharing about his day at work. I could feel the distance between him and Taylor growing with each passing day. Their son began noticing the change to innocent questions, full of confusion. "Why doesn't Daddy play with Mummy like before?" Or, "Why isn't Daddy smiling today?" Each question pierced me with a mix of sorrow and helplessness. I wanted to answer, but I didn't know what to say, because even I didn't understand what was really happening. Sometimes, when I visited in the afternoons, I would see Chris standing by the window, coffee cup in hand, eyes distant, lost in thought. I remembered mornings from before, when he would laugh with his son, hold him close, his eyes full of love. Now, that gaze seemed somewhere else, in a world only he could see. I started overhearing quiet phone calls, Chris speaking softly, laughing in a way that felt strange. I wondered, was he struggling with something inside himself? Was there something he hadn't shared with the family? The sense of unease kept growing. I realized this change wasn't just affecting Chris, it was impacting Taylor and their son too, and I felt powerless to do anything to help them. One evening, during dinner, Taylor suddenly asked, "Are you okay? I feel like we're not the same as we used to be." Chris just nodded lightly, without answering. Watching this scene, my chest felt heavy. I knew something profound was shifting in their relationship, and I felt a creeping fear about what was to come. The little signs kept accumulating. Chris withdrawing, talking less, occasionally going out alone and coming home late. I started to suspect something, but I didn't dare ask directly. I was scared of the truth, yet I couldn't ignore it. I watched Taylor silently suffer the tears in her eyes she tried to hide, the unspoken questions from their son, and I knew that whatever was coming, nothing would ever be the same again. There were moments I questioned whether Chris was truly happy. Was this happiness real, born from his own choices, or was it an inner struggle he was trying to conceal? I remembered the days he laughed with his son, played games, told silly stories, moments that now felt distant and unreachable. A mix of regret and worry weighed heavily on me. I remember one particular evening, after the boy had gone to bed, Taylor and I sat drinking tea. She sighed quietly, saying, "He's changing. I feel like I don't even know him anymore." I looked at her, my heart heavy with sorrow. I could feel her pain, her disappointment, and her fear of what the future might hold. I knew that what we were experiencing was only the beginning of a series of unpredictable changes. Each night, as I left, watching Chris standing silently by the window, I reminded myself, sooner or later the truth will come out, and when it does, we'll all have to face consequences we can't avoid. But at that time, I had no idea just how much this storm would alter the lives of our family, in ways none of us could prepare for. Gradually, the unease was no longer vague. I could see Chris changing day by day, how he smiled, how he looked at his son, how he talked to Taylor. Every little thing carried weight, a reminder that a big truth was waiting to be revealed. And when it did, none of us would ever be able to go back to the way things were before. Everything came to a head one evening at dinner. I could feel the tension hanging in the air. Taylor was exhausted and anxious. Their son played nearby, eyes full of curiosity and confusion. Chris sat there, silent for what felt like forever. I knew the moment I had sensed for weeks had finally arrived. Finally, Chris let out a long, trembling sigh. "Taylor, I need to tell you something." Taylor looked at him, eyes wide with worry, hands clutching her napkin. I'm gay. I have feelings for another man." The world seemed to collapse around me. Taylor froze, eyes wide, unable to speak. Their son looked between his father and mother, confused, not understanding what was happening. I forced myself to stay calm, though my heart felt like it was being ripped in two. Taylor broke down, not just quiet sobbing, but full-on, uncontrollable crying. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, voice choked. "Why did you let all of us live in lies?" Chris hung his head, silent, shoulders trembling. I looked at him and saw both pain and regret in his eyes. He was freeing himself, but in doing so, he had shattered Taylor's trust and happiness and that of their young son. Their son looked at us, eyes teary, unsure what to make of it. "Daddy, why?" he asked softly, voice quivering. I bent down, pulling him into my arms, wanting to protect him while holding back my own tears. I didn't know how to answer. The truth was too complicated for a 3-year-old to understand. The rest of the evening passed in heavy silence, punctuated only by sobs and awkward words. I looked at Chris and wondered, was his personal happiness worth the pain it caused the people who loved him most? I looked at Taylor, seeing her heartbreak and disappointment, yet she tried to stay strong for their son. After a while, Chris got up and left the room, leaving Taylor and their son behind. I saw the pain and confusion etched on her face. Taylor held her little boy, both of them crying silently. I wanted to say something, but words felt useless. All that remained was an oppressive silence that weighed on the house like a storm cloud. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about how a secret, no matter how carefully kept, could completely change the lives of those around it. I felt a swirl of emotions: sympathy for Chris, anger at him, and deep sorrow for Taylor and their son. I could feel everyone's pain, yet I couldn't do anything to mend it. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house was unbearably tense. Chris still lived there, but the distance between him and Taylor was now irreparable. Their son was confused, asking the same innocent questions over and over. "Why isn't Daddy with Mummy?" Or "Why is Daddy sad?" Each question was a dagger to Taylor's heart, and I watched her try to smile just to protect their son, deep down. I knew that from this moment on, our family had entered a new chapter, one full of challenges, sadness, and decisions that no one could undo. We would all have to learn to face the truth, the pain, and, most importantly, ourselves. In the days after that fateful dinner, the house was filled with a tension I had never felt before. Chris was still there, but the distance between him and Taylor was now impossible to bridge. Every time he walked into a room, the air felt heavier, and their son watched him, confused, unsure of what was happening. Taylor tried to stay composed, but the signs of exhaustion and pain were obvious. She cooked, cleaned, and cared for their son, yet her eyes seemed empty. When their son asked innocent questions like, "Why isn't Daddy with Mummy?" or "Why is Daddy sad?" I could see Taylor's struggle wanting to explain, yet fearing the truth would hurt both her child and herself. Chris, meanwhile, was quiet, sometimes stepping out for a few hours, returning tired and awkward. He still loved his son, but the way he expressed it had changed. I realized that while he was living his truth, those around him, Taylor, their son, and even me, were bearing the storm he had unleashed. One afternoon, when I visited, I found Taylor crying uncontrollably in the kitchen. "He's changed everything. I don't know what to do. Our son is too young. I don't know how to explain this to him." I held her close, feeling her pain as if it were my own. I realized she was fighting not just for a broken marriage, but for the fragile bond between her son and his father. Their son began to show his confusion. In his own way, no longer excited, clinging to his mother more often, occasionally looking at Chris with a mix of curiosity and fear. I could see the little boy enduring a confusion he couldn't articulate. The playful evenings and laughter that used to fill the house were rare now. The sense of loss in his eyes was unforgettable. Chris seemed remorseful, but remained firm in his choices. He wanted to live honestly with his feelings, yet I could see the torment within him. He knew he was hurting his ex-wife, knew he was confusing his son, but didn't know how to balance it all. I saw him standing silently by the window, eyes distant, wondering if his decision was too selfish. One day, Taylor confronted him directly. "You're not the husband I knew. We have to think about the future. For our son, for you, for all of us." Chris lowered his head, silent. The air between them was tense and heavy, and I stood nearby, witnessing a conversation I knew would forever alter the family dynamic. Over the following weeks, old habits began to disappear. Taylor and Chris started discussing divorce, with their son at the center of every decision. Every time Chris tried to play with his son, the boy would look to his mother for reassurance, his eyes a mix of fear and confusion. I could see clearly that Chris was paying a price for his truth while he was liberated. His family was slowly unraveling. I realized this was only the beginning of a long, challenging journey, one none of us could have prepared for. The truth had erupted, and the family storm had just begun. From this point on, every day would be filled with emotions, pain, and lessons we would all have to learn to continue living. After several months of tension, things started to become clearer. Chris and Taylor were moving toward divorce, no longer caught between hope and disappointment. The atmosphere in the house remained heavy, but it seemed that both had begun to accept that life was going to change. Chris gradually moved out of the old house but continued to spend time with his son. Afternoons spent reading stories, playing, or taking him to the park, though brief, became precious moments for both of them. I saw Chris happier, more at ease, but his eyes still held a lingering guilt for the pain he caused. Taylor and his son were still present. Taylor, too, slowly learned to adapt. She cared for her son even more, acting as both mother and the sole emotional anchor for him. Despite her heartbreak, she learned to accept reality and found strength in nurturing her child. I remember one visit when she gave me a weak smile. "It'll be okay." At least for him, I knew that smile carried both pain and hope, a fragile balance between loss and moving forward. Their son, though still confused, gradually adapted. He learned to love his father without the innocent, anxious questions that had plagued him before. Afternoons playing with Chris became treasured moments, and while he still remembered his parents together, he began to envision a new kind of life that included both mum and dad. But, in a different way, Chris started dating the man he had once admired from afar. When they were together, I saw a genuine happiness in him, his eyes brightening, his smile returning. Yet Chris remained cautious. he knew that this new happiness could not erase the old wounds. Every step toward the future came with responsibility and lingering guilt. One evening, the small family of Taylor and her son, along with Chris and his new partner, sat down to discuss how to arrange time with their child. I watched Chris listen to Taylor, openly discussing and trying to reach fair agreements, though the atmosphere remained tense for the first time. I saw a glimmer of hope people could move forward, even amid difficulty, while still preserving their bond with their son. I also realized that everyone's emotions were far more complicated than I had imagined. Taylor still had moments of outburst, occasionally venting anger at Chris, but that was her way of processing pain. Chris, though happy in his new relationship, experienced moments of torment and guilt, and their son, innocent and sensitive, gradually learned to navigate changes beyond his control. Small, everyday moments became more precious than ever. Mornings when Chris read stories before work, Taylor preparing breakfast, the boy laughing as his father winked at his mother. I realized that happiness isn't perfection. It's acceptance, the ability to keep moving forward despite loss and heartbreak. Additionally, Chris learned to restrain himself around his son, avoiding references to the past or mistakes. He began to understand that happiness wasn't just personal freedom, but the emotional stability of his child. Taylor, too, learned to let go of personal resentment to provide a safe environment for her son. There were days when Chris took his son to the park. They played, laughed, and Taylor watched from a distance, offering a tired but reassuring smile. I saw the boy's eyes light up, running to his father, then looking back at his mother with a bright smile. In that moment, all the emotions, pain, happiness, and hope intertwined. Deep down, I understood that this turning point, though painful, was necessary. Chris was starting to live his truth. Taylor found strength in her role as a mother, and their son was learning to adapt to a new life. Nothing was perfect, but they were moving forward, and I, standing on the sidelines, witnessed it all, feeling both the flicker of hope and the persistence of pain. Every decision mattered. Every action left its mark on all three souls. I knew the road ahead was still long, but for the first time in months, I saw light breaking through the darkness of this family in the quiet nights. After everyone had gone to sleep, I wondered, would Chris truly be happy? Could Taylor find peace for herself? And their son, would he be strong enough to understand and love both parents, even though they were no longer together as before? The answers were uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were beginning a new chapter full of challenges, yet filled with hope. In the weeks following the divorce decision, the atmosphere in the family grew thick with tension and pent-up emotions. Every time Chris came to see his son, I could feel the awkwardness in every glance, every gesture. Their son, though still loving his father, sometimes appeared confused and frightened, as if trying to find his place in a world where everything had changed. One afternoon, when Chris took his son to the park, Taylor came along. The tension was palpable, like it could explode at any moment. Chris tried to speak gently with his son, but Taylor was cautious, monitoring every word, every action. I stood nearby, feeling my heartbeat sync with the charged air. Their 4-year-old son ran toward Chris, then looked at his mother and turned away, eyes glistening. I heard Taylor sigh, her voice trembling. "You have to understand, this isn't easy for him." "It's not easy for me." Chris lowered his head in silence, shoulders heavy. At that moment, I realized Chris's happiness had reached an invisible wall. true love intertwined with responsibility and pain. That day, after returning home, Chris spoke to me with inner conflict. I want to live honestly, but every time I look at Taylor and our son, I see my mistakes etched deeper. Do you understand? I love my son, but how can I make sure he doesn't suffer? I had no words. His voice carried desperation, remorse, and yearning all at once. Taylor's struggle was no easier. She often stayed up late, sitting by the window watching her son sleep, eyes red and weary, wondering how to protect him without Chris in the way they once knew. I saw her strength, but also her vulnerability. A woman who had lost a husband, had to fulfill both parental roles and maintain composure in front of her sensitive child. Another evening, Chris brought his new partner to the house. Their presence made Taylor and the boy uneasy. The child sat quietly, confused, eyes filled with both curiosity and fear. Chris tried to explain gently, "This is my new friend, but I still love you very much." Taylor looked at him, voice trembling. "You have to make sure he isn't hurt more." Chris nodded, eyes heavy with remorse. The following days were a roller coaster of emotions. Fleeting joy when the child laughed, heartache when he asked about the old family, and moments when Chris felt both free and guilty. I watched him stand alone at times, distant eyes, silently asking himself, "Is this new happiness worth the pain it causes those I once loved?" Deep down, I realized this was the true climax, not just a marital conflict, but the struggle between personal freedom and family responsibility, between present love and past pain. Every action, every word could trigger a domino effect in the child's mind, in Taylor's heart, and in Chris himself. I saw that truth and love sometimes do not align. Chris was living authentically, but that inevitably caused unavoidable hurt. Taylor had to learn to let go to continue living and raising her son. And the child, unconsciously, was learning to accept a world in which his parents were no longer together as they once were. As night fell and the house quieted, I sat alone, reflecting on everything. I felt emptiness, but also a glimmer of lighter hope that through this trial, each member of the family, in their own way, could find peace. Yet, to reach that point, there would still be much pain, many tears, and countless confrontations with truths that no one could avoid. Time passed, and the atmosphere within the family gradually grew lighter. Chris continued to live authentically, his relationship with his new partner stable and nurturing. Taylor found inner strength, serving as both mother and steadfast support for her son. And their child, though still remembering the past, had learned to accept a new life with two fathers and two mothers in his own way. One morning, I visited Taylor and their son. The boy ran to hug Chris, then turned back and smiled at his mother. That moment was full of trust and love, without confusion or fear. I realized that after all the tears and pain, he had found a sense of security in the love of both parents. Even though they were no longer together as before, Taylor spoke to me, her voice gentle but firm. "He is living his truth, and I've learned to let go. Our son is happy, and that's what matters most." I smiled, sensing the maturity and peace in her words. She had transformed her pain into strength, learning to continue living without resentment. Chris, watching his son play, eyes filled with happiness, yet tinged with remorse, knew that while his current happiness was valuable, the pain of the past would never fully disappear. But instead of being overwhelmed by guilt, he learned to accept his responsibilities, to care for and love his son in the most positive way possible. In the following months, They established new routines. Chris took their son to school on weekend outings. Taylor stood nearby, ready to assist. I saw the boy's eyes light up whenever he saw his parents laughing together, even though they were no longer husband and wife. These small, everyday moments, hugs, goodnight kisses, laughter echoing through the kitchen, became the foundation of their new happiness. Taylor also began dedicating more time to herself, learning to care for her own emotions rather than focusing solely on her pain. She joined yoga classes, took morning walks, and started nurturing her personal interests. I saw her transformation, stronger yet softer, learning to balance motherhood with personal needs. Chris changed as well. He learned not to let guilt dominate him, instead transforming it into positive actions, spending quality time with his son, teaching him honesty and unconditional love. He even began keeping a journal, recording his thoughts and emotions about the past and the future. Facing himself without causing harm to others, the child, though young, gradually realized that love can take many forms. He learned to play with his father and his father's new partner, to listen and share his feelings with his mother, and to accept that love does not always follow a fixed pattern. I watched him, seeing in his eyes a trust in family, innocent yet resilient. One afternoon, all three, Taylor, Chris, and their son, sat together in the park, chatting and laughing without tension or forced smiles. I witnessed the boy's eyes shine, his laughter radiant, and felt that despite the pain, change had brought them to a new balance of family, different, yet filled with love. At night, when everyone was asleep, I sat quietly, reflecting on everything. I realized something important. A family does not need to be perfect to exist, and happiness is not necessarily completeness. It is the ability to accept loss, to forgive, and to learn to love in one's own way. This balance is not easy to achieve, but once it exists, it brings profound peace. This story, for me, is a lesson about humanity, love, responsibility, and forgiveness. It teaches that sometimes, to live authentically, we must confront pain, accept loss, and create happiness in our own way. And finally, as I looked at Chris, Taylor, and their son, I saw one certainty: no matter how life changes, they have found a way to continue loving, not perfectly, but sincerely, sustainably, and full of hope in the soft light of the following morning. With birds singing, Chris walked his son to school. Taylor walked beside them, and I knew they were stepping into a new chapter of life. A chapter not perfect, but full of vitality, love, and invaluable lessons about growth and forgiveness.